We now come to the urgent question. Sorry, the statement, Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I start by congratulating you, Mr. Speaker, on your very successful visit early last week to St. Helena. Mr. Speaker, with permission, I will update the House on the situation in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. Let me begin, Mr. Speaker, by reiterating Israel's right to defend itself against Hamas. We condemn the slaughter, abuse and gender-based violence perpetrated on the 7th of October 2023. Hamas's use of civilian areas, their continued failure to release hostages, and their ongoing launching of attacks into Israel. We equally are deeply concerned by the humanitarian situation in Gaza, with tens of thousands of innocent civilians killed and injured. Mr. Speaker, the most effective way to end the fighting in Gaza, the absolute focus of our diplomatic efforts right now, is to agree an immediate humanitarian pause. This would allow for the safe release of hostages and a significant increase in the aid going to Gaza. Crucially, it would also provide a vital opportunity to establish the conditions for a genuinely long-term and sustainable ceasefire without a return to destruction, fighting and loss of life. That, Mr. Speaker, is the position shared by our close partners. It is an outcome that we believe is in reach right now, and we urge all sides to seize it. Many people may ask, including some in this House, why call for a pause but not an immediate ceasefire? We do not believe that doing so, hoping it somehow becomes permanent, is the way forward. Simply calling for a ceasefire will not make it happen. There is a different and better way to stop the fighting permanently, to push for a pause, and then in that pause secure the sustainable ceasefire that can hold for the longer term without a return to the fighting. The British government has set out the vital elements to achieve a lasting peace: the release of all hostages, the removal of Hamas's capacity to launch attacks against Israel, Hamas no longer being in charge of Gaza, the formation of a new Palestinian government for the West Bank and Gaza, accompanied by an international support package, and a political horizon which provides a credible and irreversible pathway towards a two-state solution. Once we secure a pause, Mr. Speaker, we will need to take action on all of these elements to create irreversible momentum towards peace. Meanwhile, I want to stress that Britain and our partners continue to do all we can to alleviate the suffering. We have trebled our aid commitment this financial year, and we are doing everything we can to get more aid in and open more crossings. Last week, Britain and Jordan airdropped life-saving aid to a hospital in northern Gaza. 4 tons of vital supplies were provided in the airdrop, including medicines, fuel and food for hospital patients and staff. The Tel Al-Hawa hospital, set up by the Jordanian armed forces, is located in Gaza City and has treated thousands of patients since the start of the crisis. Women are bearing the brunt of the desperate humanitarian situation in Gaza today. Many thousands are pregnant and will be worrying about delivering their babies safely. That's why, over the weekend, we also announced £4.25 million in new funding for the United Nations Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency in response to an appeal for the occupied Palestinian territories. This new UK funding will help make giving birth safer and improve the lives of mothers and their newborn babies. It is clear, however, Mr. Speaker, that the flow of aid needs to be rapidly and significantly scaled up. We have reiterated the need for Israel to open more crossing points into Gaza, for Nitzana and Kerem Shalom to be open for longer, and for Israel to support the UN to distribute aid effectively across the whole of Gaza. The Foreign Secretary's representative for humanitarian affairs in the occupied Palestinian territories, Mark Bryson Richardson, is based in the region and is working intensively to address the blockages preventing more aid reaching Gaza. We also continue to urge Israel to limit its operations to military targets and avoid harming civilians and destroying homes. And we have expressed our deep concern about the prospects of a military incursion into Rafah and its consequences. Over half of Gaza's population, Mr. Speaker, are sheltering in the area, including more than 600,000 children. They have nowhere to go. And the Rafah crossing remains vital to ensure aid can reach the people who so desperately need it. Mr. Speaker, the path to a long-term solution will not be easy. Ultimately, a two-state solution is the best way to ensure safety and security for both Israelis and Palestinians. The Foreign Secretary underlined this at the G20 Foreign Ministers meeting in Rio last week. And the Prime Minister and all ministerial colleagues will continue to press for this in engagements with regional partners, including with Prime Minister Netanyahu. We welcome the prospect of further normalisation agreements between Israel and Arab partners. We are committed to supporting their enduring success and to supporting efforts to ensure normalisation delivers benefits for the Palestinians as well. Our long-standing position remains that we will recognise a Palestinian state at a time that is most conducive to the peace process. The Palestinian Authority has an important long-term role to play and will need continued support from us and our partners, but it must also take concrete steps on reform. The Palestinian people need a technocratic and effective administration that can win the confidence of the people of Gaza. We stand ready, Mr. Speaker, to support the Palestinian Authority to achieve this aim, following the announcement of the Prime Minister and previous set of ministers' resignation yesterday. We also remain concerned about the situation in the West Bank and have taken action in response to extremist settler violence. Let me end, Mr. Speaker, by repeating our commitment to finding a lasting resolution to this conflict that ensures Israelis and Palestinians can live in the future with dignity and security. The goal of our diplomacy in the Middle East is to see an end to the fighting and to create a permanent peace based on a new political horizon for the region. We will continue working tirelessly to make this happen.
SNP spokesperson Brendan O'Hara.
I thank the Minister for prior sight of his statement, and we welcome the news that a ceasefire deal may be edging closer. A ceasefire and hostage release deal which we've been calling for since it became apparent that Israel's self-defence had actually turned into a war against an entire civilian population. A war in which in just 5 months 30,000 people have been killed, 80,000 injured, 2 million displaced, and now 500,000 innocent people facing starvation. Not because the food isn't available, but because of a premeditated decision to impose a collective punishment, one which has deliberately stopped food getting to those who need it. And yet, throughout this unimaginable horror, the UK continues to profit from this carnage by selling weapons to Israel. And shamefully, there has been no real desire or attempt on the part of the UK to make this slaughter stop. They seem happy to continue to provide tacit support to the illegal occupation and the systematic decades-long oppression and persecution and now ethnic cleansing and collective punishment which goes with it. So if and when we get a US deal to the UN, what action will the UK government take? Because voting for a ceasefire cannot exist in isolation. Will the UK government stop selling weapons to Israel? Will it finally get behind the International Court of Justice investigation? And will it fund, as it did quite rightly in the case of Ukraine, an international criminal court investigation into Israel's prosecution of this conflict? But whatever happens, Minister, this sorry episode will be remembered for being one of the most shameful in the history of British foreign policy. Because what we have witnessed is a complete dereliction of all moral and legal responsibility from a government and a parliament who, at a time of greatest humanitarian crisis, have simply looked the other way. And quite rightly, history will judge them harshly for it.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I simply don't think the idea that the government has looked the other way carries any possible credibility at all. And I must say to him that in all his remarks, he might remember that the source of all of this was October the 7th. It was the pogrom committed against the Israeli people, and it was the worst act, killing of more Jewish people than at any time since the end of the Second World War. So I think there needs to be some balance in what is said. But and I also think that his language that he uses is not helpful in the central aim of all of us, to try and bring about a ceasefire and the ability to get the hostages out and to get aid in. I also think that he should remember that Britain has the toughest weapons regulation and arms export regime anywhere in the world. He talks about collective punishment, but the point that he misses is that our determination since day one has been to get as much food as we possibly can into Israel. If he looks back at everything that the government has said on this, we have been working as hard as anyone to get that humanitarian relief into Gaza. And I submit, Mr. Speaker, that beneath the sound and fury of what he has said, there is more substantial agreement between his party and the government than he is recognising.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a few weeks ago, the Minister for Trade Policy told Westminster Hall in a debate on arms exports to Israel that we take our obligations in this space exceptionally seriously. As I have shown before, we have acted to change policy in relation to changing circumstances on the ground. The circumstances are tragic and brutal and crystal clear to anyone willing to see them. Gaza razed to the ground, civilians actively targeted, potentially using the very equipment that the UK is exporting to Israel. Over 12,000 children butchered, with the IDF busy taking selfies over the ruins and bodies. What exactly will it take for this government to suspend arms exports to Israel?
Well, the position, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the Minister set out in Westminster Hall was absolutely correct. The government takes legal advice on this matter. The Arms Committee does its work effectively. Arms Export Committee does its work effectively, and we will continue to act on the advice that we are given when we are given it.
David Linden.
Speaker, the Minister makes great play on page 2 of his statement, saying we also announced £4.25 million in new funding for the United Nations Sexual and Reproductive Agency in response to appeals from the OPTs. How can you compare that £4.25 million figure with the amount of money that UK companies are benefiting from in terms of arms sales that are slaughtering thousands of children?
Minister.
Well, as the honourable gentleman will know, we have tripled our aid into the occupied Palestinian territories. And while it may seem like a relatively small figure, we are careful guardians of British taxpayers' money, and we spend what we know we can do effectively. He will understand from the position that exists at the moment on the West Bank and indeed in Gaza the difficulty of making these subventions really count on the ground. But he will also understand the very great need for it.
Drew Hendry.
Madam Deputy Speaker, will the UK continuing to sell arms to Israel result in fewer innocent civilians losing their lives in Gaza?
I've set out, Madam Deputy Speaker, the fact that Britain has the toughest arms export regulations anywhere in the world, and ministers rely upon the legal advice and other advice which accompanies the work of an independent committee within government.
Patrick Grady.
Speaker, the Minister keeps referring to the government's amendment last week, but those are just words on bits of paper in the recycle bin. They could have been the resolution of this House, but the government chose not to give this House that choice. So what message? So instead, the resolution of this House is that there should be an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. So what message does it send to the UN Security Council and the wider international community if the government won't adopt the language that has been agreed by the democratic legislature to which it is accountable, i.e. this House of Commons?
Minister.
I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the honourable gentleman is rewriting history. What happened last week saw the Leader of the House, a member of the government, defending the rights of minority parties, in particular his, from this dispatch box.
Kenny McCaskill.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Development assistance for the occupied Palestinian territories had already reduced from £95 million in 2013 to £26 million in 2023 before the suspension of UNRWA funding. Despite questions today and indeed specific written questions, the Government has refused to declare where the source and what the source was for the basis of the allegations and where that source came from, leaving many to speculate that it is simply Israeli allegations or indeed Israeli propaganda. Other countries, including Ireland and Spain, are continuing to fund UNRWA. Will the Government not ensure that UNRWA funding is restored to avoid the perversity that we can find weapons for munitions in Ukraine and we cannot find money for humanitarian aid in Gaza?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, he will know that we are waiting for the interim report, the forensic report into collusion, which the UN Office of Independent Oversight is preparing. It is right to wait for that report and indeed Catherine Colonna's report as well. But as I explained to the Right Honourable Gentleman, British funding is up to date and will be paused until we've seen those reports, but additional funding has been made available to UNRWA. And as the House will accept, UNRWA's logistical support, its warehouses, its vehicles, are essential to the distribution of aid within Gaza.
Alan Dorrans.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Good afternoon. Madam Deputy Speaker, will the United Kingdom Government take the evidence of the collective punishment of Gaza with the dehumanisation of Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and come to the conclusion that the Israeli government is authorising an oppressive regime with the goal of the complete displacement of the Palestinian people?
Minister.
No, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Patricia Gibson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the horror and huge numbers of casualties in Gaza is unfolding for all the world to see. Alone of the three largest parties in this House, the SNP has called for an immediate ceasefire, not a humanitarian pause or a humanitarian ceasefire. And we've also called for an end to collective punishment, which constitutes a war crime and has cost 30,000 lives so far and left 500,000 facing death by starvation. And our constituents are rightly outraged. Now, regardless of the Minister's own personal views, does he share my concern that members of this House have been denied a recorded vote to express their views on these life or death matters, which is what our constituents want to see?
Mr.
Without Madam Deputy Speaker revisiting the events of last week, I have no doubt of the worry of our constituents to which she refers. And that is why I set out at the beginning why I think the position of the British government, as articulated in the amendment to which I failed to move last week, that the contents of that amendment, I believe, command widespread support amongst our constituents and although it wasn't voted on, as she rightly says, they do set out the position of the government, and it is one which I think should be widely supported amongst our constituents.
Deirdre Brock.
Deputy Speaker, it's been suggested that if what Israel has done in Gaza becomes the accepted standard of self-defence, a core principle that is meant to protect us all and is at the core of the international world order on which democracies are founded is greatly undermined. How does the Minister respond to that?
Minister.
This is an unprecedented set of calamities that have taken place. I reiterate that Israel has the absolute right of self-defence, but must remain within international humanitarian law. It's very important to hang on to those principles as we navigate this catastrophe.
Peter Grant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister has quite rightly reminded us that as a matter of international humanitarian law, Israel has the right to defend itself against any aggressor. He also pointed out that that right must be exercised in compliance with international humanitarian law. So can I ask him to clarify the Government's understanding of two of those specific conditions? Can he confirm that self-defence cannot justify attacks on a civilian population who pose no threat to anybody? And can he also confirm that self-defence does not apply to military action which is clearly disproportionate or indeed, as President Biden said last week, over the top?
Minister.
Well, I think in respect of both his two latter questions, the position is covered by what I have made clear from the start of the statement, that Israel does indeed have the right of self-defence under international law, but it must be conducted within international humanitarian law. And I think it is that context, which I have repeatedly reiterated, which answers his second two questions.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Arms sales from Netherlands to Israel has been halted after the court in the Netherlands found it's a clear risk that components were used to commit or facilitate serious violations of international humanitarian law, and the court also highlighted evidence of Israeli deliberate, disproportionate, indiscriminate attacks, failure to warn civilians, and incriminating statements made by Israeli commanders and soldiers. Now, given that clear court ruling, doesn't that make a nonsense of the Minister's claim that the UK has got the toughest arms export licence control in the world? And isn't it the case that if the UK doesn't stop selling arms to Israel, then it's also going to be complicit in breaches of humanitarian law?
Well, I don't agree with that analysis, and I think you have to look at the small print of the way in which our arms export restrictions and operations operate in order to see that is not the case. But I have set out very clearly, Madam Deputy Speaker, the way in which the arms export regime works, and I'm afraid I have nothing to add to what I said earlier in that respect.
Carol Monaghan.
We've heard many times about Israel's right to defend itself. In fact, the Minister started his statement by reiterating Israel's right to defend itself. On Sunday evening in Gaza City, the IDF fired on Palestinians who were waiting for food aid trucks to arrive. 10 were killed. Does the Minister believe this is a legitimate act of self-defence?
Minister.
Well, unlike the other forces which are involved in this dreadful conflict, Israeli soldiers, members of the IDF, are taught as part of their basic training about international humanitarian law. As I mentioned, there are lawyers embedded in the military forces as they make decisions on actions. That is not something which you see in other forces in the region and non-state actors. And although all deaths are to be regretted, we underline that international humanitarian law is very clear that all parties must respect it. We are deeply concerned about the lack of humanitarian access. We are deeply concerned about the protection of civilians. And as I set out in my earlier remarks, Madam Deputy Speaker, we believe that the amendment, which was not moved but which was tabled by the government last week, is a set of circumstances which, across the House, everyone should be able to support.